Freiburger here with the inside story on the Cheap Thrills Dart. And yes, that is the car with the hose clamp transmission mount. The very first car, I think, where people really noticed my byline when I was a staff editor for Hot Rod magazine was the 1968 Dodge Dart that was known as Cheap Thrills. My whole goal with the car was to try and go as quick as I could in a quarter mile for less than $2,000. And I'm telling you, it was a hack and slash proposition. All low buck parts, and I counted every single dime. And it was interesting because all of a sudden we got tons and tons of mail, and it was really surprising me how popular the car is even today. People ask me about the Cheap Thrills Dart all the time, perhaps because it really set the stage for what I would go on to do as the editor of Carcraft magazine, and of course in my Roadkill TV show. So in this episode, I am going to tell you the whole background story of how that car came to be, give you a little bit of insight on some behind the scenes stuff that probably isn't really known. I'm going to ask you if you know where the car is today and let you know when the last time is that I saw it. Unfortunately, back then I didn't take a whole lot of photos. These were the days of magazine black and white photography, and we would hand in our film and get a proof sheet and mark off a couple of prints that we wanted, and we'd get those prints back, and the rest of it went to the archive. So I really don't have a lot of photos of this, and some of the photos I'm going to show you here are fairly fuzzy, so I apologize in advance, but let's get into the story. I started as a staff member at Hot Rod magazine in December of 1991. And by 1993, I had the idea that I wanted to build this super low buck project car. Now, the editor at the time was Jeff Smith. He hired me. And I gotta say, I cannot say anything bad about Jeff Smith. He was a mentor to me. He ran Hot Rod magazine. He ran Carcraft magazine, arguably both of them at their peak. He taught me a lot. But probably at the time I would have said some negative words about him because he would not let me do the low buck project car. In his opinion, it wasn't good enough for Hot Rod magazine. And I can appreciate that as the editor of Hot Rod subsequently. You know, it's a brand that you don't want to tarnish. And he thought that this project car really would. But I had a different perspective on it. I was looking at the beaters that had been in Hot Rod magazine, and I was inspired by them. The first, I would say, goes back to 1982, and the very first primered car that was on the cover, it was called the Eastwood and Bearcat 32 Ford. It was a two-door sedan. And Gray Baskerville did a story on this thing, and it went, I think, 1150s and was dirt cheap and was primer and was thrown together with spare parts. And a lot of people remember that car because it was an inspiration that said to you, I can actually do this. And as a matter of fact, that Eastwood and Bearcat 32 was the car that made me realize that I could get into hot rods, meaning pre-war cars instead of just muscle cars. So there was the Eastwood and Bearcat car, first primer car on the cover. And then in 1984, Marlon Davis did a series on this 69 Oldsmobile Cutlass that was known as the Junkyard Dog. And he did two different articles on it. I think they went 1338 for about $3,500 with that car. And it had a 455 in it. And they even painted it. They made it into a decent car. But I always thought that it was slightly bogus because he had outside shops do the work. And then he sort of calculated what it could have cost if you did it yourself. And I thought that wasn't legitimate. So that appeared in, I think, the October and November issues of Hot Rod in 1984. And then, of course, the major low buck thing that so many people remember, it came when Pat Ganal was the editor of the magazine, and it was Caddy Hack, where they took a full-size Cadillac and they ran it at the now defunct LACR, Los Angeles County Raceway, and they piled a bunch of people into it and ran the thing down the track at like 6,700 pounds, and then they just kept sawing sheet metal off the thing until it finally went into the 13s with no body. And that was a very hack and slash kind of thing. So I thought there was precedent for Hot Rod magazine to do something like this. Now, eventually, Jeff was no longer the editor of Hot Rod magazine, and a new guy came in, Steve Campbell, who had been my boss and editorial director when I was the editor of Four Wheel and Off-Road magazine. And so I pitched Project Cheap Thrills to him, and he said yes, and I decided to build a big block Mopar A-body because I had been inspired to build one of those by Carcraft magazine back in the day, and because I had a lot of experience with them already, having built a couple with my friends. To get the baseline car that I was looking for, I went to our friend Tony Martinez, who was running Memory Lane Auto, which was a classic car junkyard that was off to the side in the corner of the pick your part yard that we all used. All of us magazine editor guys would go pull engines out of pick your part in Sun Valley, California, and Memory Lane was sort of off to the side. So I asked him what I was looking for, and I specifically wanted a 68 Dart just because I love the body style and because I was so inspired by Hemi darts and things like that. And he came up with one, and I paid him $350 for it, which even at the time admittedly was a good guy deal. The car was pretty beat up, and it had a 273 and an automatic in it. The car was Matador red and had a vinyl top on it. So I picked that up out of Memory Lane. After that, I started buying the cars that would become donors to compile into one car that would be the Cheap Thrills Dart. The first car that I bought in order to start compiling a bunch of parts into one viable Cheap Thrills Dart was a 1970, or maybe it was a 71 Plymouth Duster 340. It was a real 340 car, and if I remember correctly, it was sassy grass green, and I paid $250 for it. Now here's the behind the scenes thing that we didn't put in the magazine at the time, and I'm not sure I've ever made this publicly known. Unfortunately, that car had hit and killed a pedestrian, and that's why it was being sold for so cheap. The guy just wanted out of its life. I guess he had gone through the police investigation with it, and they gave him the car back, and he was like, I'm done with this. So that's depressing, but it did turn into a lot of good parts. I was able to pull the 8 3/4 rear end out of that and a bunch of miscellaneous sheet metal. I cut a patch out of the hood for something. And then I took the 340 that was in it, and I ended up trading that, plus a little cash, I think, for a 1975 Dodge Ram Charger. That also wasn't originally spelled out in Hot Rod Magazine. I think we credited that I had sold the engine for $700 because I think I got a $700 discount on a Ram Charger that I think I paid $1,500 for. It was in that neighborhood. So that's what I credited in the story, was $700. Because, by the way, in the Cheap Thrills Dart stories, I was allowed to sell off the stuff that I was buying in order to turn a profit, or at least break even, and keep the costs down. And so I traded it for a 75 Dodge Ram Charger. This thing was great. It was just like the trucks that appeared in a couple of the factory press photos. It looked like it was Hemi orange. I think they called it a different color, but it was basically Hemi orange, had white at the bottom. When I got it, it was great. 360 automatic. It would bark the tires into second. When I was the editor for Wheel and Off-Road, I ended up lifting the thing, putting it on 36s, putting Dana 60s in it, having to cut the fenders for tire clearance. I honestly kind of ruined that Ram Charger, and I don't know where it is today. I sold it to a guy who told me that he was a police officer. I saw it once afterwards when he painted it black, and I don't know where it is today. But anyway, that's the connection of my Ram Charger to the Cheap Thrills Dart. After buying the Duster and parting it out and using parts on the 68 Dart, I ended up buying a 68 Imperial. This car, by today's standards, would be killer. It was like old man fresh, black leather interior, pretty straight and clean, factory black car, and it ended up having a 1970 440 HP engine in it, obviously that had been swapped in later at some time. I paid $400 for that car, pulled the engine and trans out so that it could go in the Dart, and then sold the car for $200 because there was a guy who wanted the deck lid off of it. I also kept the hubcaps off of it. I think I sold those at a swap meet, and somewhere in my garage here, I still have the really cool deck lid sort of bird badge emblem that was on the car. That's still around here somewhere. That car, I drag tested it to see how quick it was before we parted it out. It went 1820 in the quarter mile at 76 miles an hour. The Cheap Thrills Dart would end up going much quicker. I took that 440 out of the Imperial with its 727 automatic, cleaned it all up, painted it using Chevy orange because it was cheaper than Hemi orange. That like torqued a lot of Mopar guys at the time, and ended up throwing it in the Dart. This is what leads to the car's real point of notoriety, which is I had gotten a used Mopar Performance big block swap K member that used the later type spool motor mounts. And I think it was manufactured incorrectly, or there was something that I didn't understand at the time, because when I got the engine in the car on the spool mounts, The motor mount would not line up. I believe the engine was too far forward because I also had difficulty getting a fan on it. And so what I ended up doing is setting the transmission on the cross member and crossing 2 giant hose clamps to hold it down. I remember Jeff Smith at the time, even though he wasn't working at Hot Rod. I think he was a staffer on Hot Rod. He went from editor to staffer, and him just going, I can't even believe we're printing this. This is just totally unacceptable. And obviously a lot of the readership thought that too, but many of them remember the car to this day because of the hose clamp trans mounts. People will still comment to me when I butcher some car together, does it have hose clamp trans mounts? And that's why. And now, with the car mostly assembled, the very first part of the editorial story begins in the March 1994 issue of Hot Rod magazine. The next 2 stories came in the April and May issues as I went to the track and drag tested the thing in 2 different phases. In the very first configuration, I had said that the car had cost me $872.26. At this point, the engine in the Dart was the completely stock but degreased and spruced up 440 out of the Imperial. It even still had the Carter carburetor on it. It ran 1381 in the quarter mile. Now in the second installment, I came back and I think there was multiple drag strip trips involved because initially I ran it with the stock 440 and I put some 430 gears in the back of it and ultimately ended up changing the intake manifold, carburetor, and put a Mopar 509 cam in it at the recommendation of Mopar Performance's Larry Shepard, who was like a superhero to me at the time because I'd read about him for so long and I misspelled his name in the story. Nonetheless, he advised me on the 509 cam. I threw it in the thing, and in that installment, the car finally ran 1269 in the quarter for a reported $1,886.92. At this point, I have to talk to you about something that really weighed on me as a magazine staffer way back then, and that is corrected ET. The Cheap Thrills Dart really ran 1312, and we ran an altitude corrected number in the magazine. Now, this was policy at the time. Because Los Angeles County Raceway was up at elevation, I think 3,500 feet, we would use the NHRA standard correction factor to correct everything that we did. And the thing that I thought was bogus about it is that we wouldn't actually take the corrected or the density altitude from that day and apply a correction. We would just take a blanket correction and use it. And so it was honestly kind of bogus. And what always bugged me is that the guys who would test cars back in Englishtown, New Jersey, they would have a mine shaft weather conditions, and they were always quicker than we were when they were testing new cars and things like that. And we just kept on using that correction factor. Later, when I was the editor, I undid that and reported always observed DT because I figured that's all that really matters is what happened on that day is what happened on that day. The problem with that is you can't compare day to day when you're doing or trying to do A/B testing on parts or anything. Different subject. The Cheap Thrills Dart really went 1312, but at altitude, it was obviously a 12-second car. After those 3 stories in Hot Rod with the build and testing of the Cheap Thrills Dart, what happened with it? Well, it went on the very first Hot Rod magazine Power Tour in 1995. At that time, I had been promoted to being the editor of Peterson's 4-Wheel and Off-Road magazine, but I was still really tight with all the guys on the staff, and it was a very recent change, and I still had the Cheap Thrills Dart. So I paid way more than I thought I should have to fix the transmission, put a brand new transmission in it, because it had been slipping in all of the drag strip testing. That's even reported in those stories. But it went on the power tour with that brand new transmission, and I didn't know at the time how to handle the throttle valve linkage that was on the torque flight, and by Cedar City, Utah, I had blown the thing up. I led the drive for some period of time, but then it smoked. It went on the trailer, and the other staffers took a piece of chalk or something and wrote "Trailer Queen" down the side of the Dart, and that hurt. But we did tow it all the way to the final stop in Columbus, Ohio, and we did have it on display alongside stuff like Gray Baskerville's 32 Ford, the Crusher Camaro, a 67 Fairlane that Rob Canan and I had painted, and other staff cars like that. So it didn't technically long haul the first power tour, but it was there. I mentioned to you that I was the editor of Four Wheelin' Off-Road at this point. Here's sort of an obscure side unknown fact, which is there was a Cheap Thrills project truck at Four Wheelin' Off-Road also. It wasn't mine. It belonged to a staffer named Ed Fortson. It was a square body, short bed, step side 4x4. And he had pitched it to me and I thought, man, I just had a big win with the Cheap Thrills Dart. We can do a low buck thing. And to be honest, I was never really happy with how cheap we had done that truck. With the Dart, I had done it dirtball. I had done it all with my own hands. I had bought, sold, traded to get every dime. I added up every dime, and the truck wasn't exactly that. It was practical. There was nothing wrong with it, but I was probably a jerk to Ed Fortson at the time about it because I really expected it to be just as gritty as the Dart was, and it kind of wasn't. Hot Rod Magazine shipped the Dart home to me after Power Tour, but at this point I was the editor of Four Wheelin' Off-Road. I felt the car had run its course and the transmission was blown up. I didn't want to spend the money to do another one. I ended up selling the Cheap Thrills Dart for $800. It went to a guy who worked at Sunset Tattoo in Hollywood, and he also had a 70 Chrysler 300H, a Hearst Chrysler. And so I thought it was cool that he also had the Dart, and I saw that thing around Hollywood for many, many years. And then I just lost track of it and it vaporized. Now, go forward to the year 2009. I had just finished working for an online venture called Roadkill TV, and I was back at Hot Rod Magazine, and I had gotten an email, I think, from somebody through Roadkill TV where they had seen an ad and they had seen the Dart for sale. I believe it was in the Phoenix area. And I looked at the photos and sure enough, it was the Cheap Thrills Dart. I hadn't seen this thing since probably, let's say, 1996 at this point, but I knew it was the same car. Somebody had painted a bumblebee stripe on the back that did not look right. It was too thin. I didn't like it. I had painted the vinyl top gray, and somebody had painted it black in the subsequent years. And the worst part about it is that it had been completely crunched in the front. Somebody had been in an accident with it, and the whole front clip was gone. Under the hood, maybe it was the same 440. I'm not sure. Somebody had changed the intake manifold carburetor valve covers. They'd added a proportioning valve. So there were some changes to the thing, but I got in touch with the seller, and unfortunately he immediately knew who I was. And he told me that he wanted $12,000 for the Cheap Thrills Dart at that point. I think I must have guffawed in his face. I think I probably said to him, I would give you $3,000 for it, and that would be incredibly generous. Remember, this is 2009. Old car pricing was not what it is today. This car was not worth anything like $12,000, even as a famous old magazine car. And so after that, I got back and forth with the guy a little bit. He gave up on me because I obviously wasn't going to give him money. And to this day, I still don't know where the Cheap Thrills Dart is. So maybe I can ask your help. Have you seen that thing around? Do you know where it is? Did it get sold? Did it go to a junkyard? I have no idea. If it surfaced again, it would have to be, once again, pretty cheap for me to bother to buy it back. It seems like I would want to get it and like relive old glory and everything. But with the front clip gone and the other things that were done to it and my lack of interest at this point, I probably wouldn't, but I'd love to know where it is. In my days most recently as a TV guy, Steve Dulcich and I came across another person who had a 68 440 Dart. And I ended up buying that one. This is just a couple years ago. And it was turbine bronze. Neat car. We did an episode of Roadkill Garage on Motor Trend where Steve and I took the engine compartment that was hideously painted teal and white and had wires running everywhere. We pulled the 440, cleaned it all up, painted the engine compartment, put it back in, made it nice. But the rest of the car was still a beater, and it reminded me so much of the Cheap Thrills Dart. That's why I wanted it, is that it was very nostalgic for me. But that ran its course fairly quickly, and I ended up selling that car to Derek at Vice Grip Garage. I don't think he's done an episode with that one yet, but you'll probably see it eventually. As a matter of fact, Finnegan and I went to Derek's place and did an episode of Roadkill where we drove from there to George Ray's Wildcat drag strip in Arkansas. And that was a really cool one. I had fun with that Dart. I loved it, but it wasn't the same. And so I ended up selling that. And the thing that I have today that is most reminiscent of the Cheap Thrills dart is a 1971 Plymouth Duster known as the Red Duster, and it is also a junkyard used parts kind of assemblage of stuff. It's a Magnum 360 4-speed used 8 3/4 that I cobbled together. So, going back to my earliest days at Hot Rod Magazine into what I'm doing now on Roadkill and Roadkill Garage, I'm still kind of tinkering with the Mopar A-bodies in dirt cheap fashion. And you can see that Red Duster coming up on episodes right here on the David Freiburger channel. And that's the story of the Cheap Thrills dart. Help me find the thing. You can also help me out by watching another video right now. Of course, like, comment, subscribe, all that stuff. And the link to merch is in my description.